Hey guys, GWS here to do something that I think a lot of people have requested, and I haven't really done this enough justice because, let's be frank, and I'm just going to be honest, I am a centrist in terms of my policy, but in terms of where I see the problem, it is with the left. Given that, I would like to do a series for everybody viewing this, all my critics, just to explain to you guys my diversity of issues that I may not have a chance to talk about very often because of what I'm often responding to. And let me just explain why a lot of this is that let me pull this down, make sure everybody can, because these are my notes, and I just want to make sure they are appearing properly. Yeah, nice desktop, eh? um, yeah. Anyhow, this is going to be my opportunity to explain a lot of these issues. I'll just put this up here. You guys probably won't see the full thing, but I'm going to go through this anyhow. This is mostly for me so I can stay a little bit on point, I guess. Instead of talking about three issues for 50 minutes, I can talk about a few. Okay. Now, these are my issues. First of all, anti-drug war. I'm sure a lot of people would guess this, considering my libertarian stance. And the drug war really has not worked. It's just, I think it was formed with the best of intent, because initially it wasn't punish them with jail. Initially it was about rehabilitation, just getting people off, and then Reagan kind of made it authoritative, and then Clinton just went off the rails with it and just said, let's just throw them all in prison. This has not worked. We have not seen any improvements. The drugs are getting worse. The cartels are getting richer because it's a supply and demand thing. There is a very high demand and there is a very low supply, and there is a limited number of people who can supply drugs, smuggle them into the United States, and those are the people who get all the money. So what you do is, I just believe in just legalizing it. Don't tax it. Just legalize it in the privacy of your own home. Now, using it in public's a different story. Like if you're using drugs in public and it comes with another crime, you don't just arrest somebody for the drugs. It's like with alcohol. You get arrested for something when you're drinking, you get public intoxication. Or if you just get involved with the law in the wrong way. That's the way drugs needs to be, is if you're doing it within the privacy of your own home, you're not driving while you're doing it, you're not endangering others while you're doing it, then you should be allowed to take in anything. And that's just a reality. Like there can be a few regulations in terms of how you grow it, because there are ecological impacts from growing things such as marijuana, for example, where it can upset the ecosystem if people are growing massive amounts of it, because the animals that eat it fall easy prey to predators, and that upsets the balance. Because if all the prey is eaten, then all the predators die too, and then you just upset everything. So everybody could probably guess that one. It's not a very, I don't even think it's that controversial of a position anymore, even on the right, because even right wingers, I'm sure, especially with the opioid epidemic, is just like, there's no winning this war, period. Reasonable regulations in welfare. I'm sure, this is kind of a center right point. Well, a center left, I should say, not center right. But I am for deregulating, and I am for consolidating welfare benefits, and you'll see that with my UBI thing. But yeah, these things need to exist, period. And I just feel like some people go over the board with the free market because the free market handles things better. That is unequivocal, and I believe in that. But um, when it comes to the security of people, making 100% sure that somebody is not going to die simply because they have lack of access to something, you have to have a bottom line to that. There has to be a minimum standard for everybody. I don't care if you're deserving or not, if you've done everything to wreck your life or not. There should be a bottom where you could be the most horrible piece of crap of a person. Um, and I just believe in that minimum standard because I think that is how God would want us to treat people, is to give them that minimum standard. So yes, you have to have reasonable regulations too, because yeah, you have to deregulate, but at the end of the day, you have to have regulations that provide minimum protections for workers. You don't have to protect every little thing, but you do have to protect them from various hazards, mostly things that would be difficult to obtain information on. In terms of regulations, here's really my philosophy. My philosophy is that regulations need to be in the form of transparency and information over mandates. So, for example, if something is dangerous, don't mandate people don't take it, but you make that company label it, you make that company warn other people, you make sure that people have the opportunity to get the information to make an informed decision. And that's basically my big thing. So yeah, Monsanto, label your GMOs, and I'm sure we can actually regulate more in the information aspect, information providing, forcing companies to, like I said, put it out there specifically. Like, your ingredients, like they hide behind all these things where they don't have to list everything. It's just put it all out there. That's basically how I think of it. And this leads universal basic income. This is one of my most extreme left-wing positions because I believe that if you replace all current entitlements with a universal basic income, um, perhaps you can make it a little bit more nuanced, but I think it really should be super simple. And the reason is you don't have complaints about fraud, abuse. You don't have to have a bunch of government oversight over it. You don't have to have the overhead costs, administration, or you don't have to have phone lines, because all the universal basic income could be handled through the Treasury and through the IRS. Basically, what it is this: is you file your taxes. If you make less than $40,000 a year, you get X amount of dollars. And over $40,000 a year, it gets taken away dollar for dollar. So, for example, if we decided each person gets $700, then what you would do is, if they made, say, $40,500, they would get a $200 check per month from the government from then until next April. And that's how you would handle that, or maybe June. You could hash that out, but basically, each year the IRS does that calculation. Kind of like when they do your refund, they just decide what kind of monthly check you're going to get. Or, now I wouldn't say bulk sum give you, but they could decide that every month, and then you just get a check from the Treasury. And that's how you'd handle a universal basic income. You wouldn't need Medicare, Medicaid, any of that, because you can be responsible saving up your own money, etc. And that would be on you, because you're given the resources that you need. And we could still have basic 911 and stuff. You can have your basic services, but in terms of income, everything can be replaced with a universal basic income, I believe. And that would really help dependents, because dependents, of course, they aren't gonna work, so therefore they aren't filing taxes, so they get the 700 or whatever dollars it would be. And that's how that should be handled, because that's what most people need to live on, basically. And then, like any difference, you should be able to make up in charities and all that. But I do believe in a universal basic income. You consolidate all entitlements into it, all of them. But, and here's another thing that's not on this list, but I kind of want to bring up too, is the fact that, well, this is kind of a right-wing point. I don't even know if I should talk about it, but yeah, we're gonna skip it because this is about my left-wing positions, and so I'm just not bringing that part up. But I do, briefly speaking, I do believe in block granting and giving people more control over when and what they can use their Medicare and Medicaid on if we don't go the UBI route. Some split on maternity leave. Maternity leave does, I think there's some very good arguments for it. I think there's also some very good arguments why you wouldn't want to have it. But my left-wing position is, like, a lot of that really should be off the table. Like, if you're 2 weeks pregnant and a doctor says you can't be working because otherwise you could miscarry, or you could cause danger to your kid, especially if you have some other medical condition, then that should really be off the table. You just should not be working, period. And that should be paid time off, because that can't be controlled. But you got to be careful with it too, because the problem is if you're mandating that, then that comes with every time a lady applies for work. It's just like, one side of me says it should be free market, her negotiate, but there is a big argument, a big one, for just having it off the table, especially if something pops up, and especially considering some other positions I hold on family planning that I will not mention here. So pro-union, I'm pro-union and pro-anti-union as well. So here's what this means. You got to give people the right to unionize. I don't care. And you cannot fire somebody for unionizing. That should be mandated. When people get fired from McDonald's because they try to form a union, that is wrong. And that should not be allowed. You should be allowed to form any union of your co-workers that you please, with no possibility of firing. And there is some argument to say companies should be able to hire and fire who they want, but I don't believe that should apply to unions, because a union is just, it's a gathering, it's an assembly, it's a gathering, and that shouldn't really be on limits to a company. That is really going in the direction of censorship. But while people have the right to unionize, you need to give the opposite right too. The right to not join the union. And that right would mean stuff like right to work, or preventing unions from harassing, coercing people into joining the union, or bosses from trying to force it without saying so. Like, you have to have it both ways. Basically, here's the thing. Unions are wonderful things, and you gotta have them. You gotta have them because it is the workers equalizing the playing field and trying to create better conditions for themselves. That is a very good thing, and we need to preserve that, but we do need to preserve the purity of that, and that's important. When people come together with the desire to do so, with the desire to improve their own working conditions, their wages, their benefits, etc., You know, that is a wonderful thing, and it's a wonderful thing when when it is genuine. It's basically okay. So here's a big left wing one right here. Break them up. Break them up. That's Bernie Sanders saying break them up. You know, I disagree with Bernie Sanders on probably 95% of things. This is one of the 5% where I agree with him. The big banks, Goldman Sachs, um, you know, Wells Fargo, all these huge banks, all these Goliaths, you have to break them up. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, you got to break them up, and you got to take their privileges away. You have to put these banks under the same regulations that commercial banks are put under. Don't put them under the SEC, put them under commercial bank regulations, etc. Because that's part of the problem. It's a problem with Dodd-Frank too. Is there's a lot of unequal regulation between small and big banks. You have the small banks, your little commercial banks, um, or even your big commercial banks with your little branches. It is ridiculously hard for these banks to grow. You know, they get their capital and they can grow a little bit, but not compared to the big banks, which are regulated by the SEC, which pretty much is the Wild West. There's not much regulation done there, and what little there is not even enforced. You know, nobody's going to jail. They're not breaking anybody up, even though they say they can. They're not doing it. And so, yeah, you got to break these banks up. You got to regulate them at the same rate. Period. And because a lot of the thing too is this is one thing where, yeah, the government actually does a good job if it's done right. Look at the breakup of AT&T. It was probably the best thing in history that the U.S. government has ever done. Because look what the breakup of AT&T did, and look at what was going on before it. Before AT&T was broken up, you had them under Title II. You had them under, you know, it was basically a whole government partnership thing. It was like, you know, nobody could really compete with AT&T. It was, and they didn't have to innovate. They could keep their rates high. They could charge whatever they wanted for long distance, and the technology was stagnant for decades. Almost nothing, probably since the 1940s, 1950s, was done to improve the system of phone lines. We could have ridiculous communication speeds and all that if the breakup of AT&T happened earlier, but the government always protected them. And when we broke them up, what happened? That's when you saw everything explode technologically, cell phones, eventually iPhones, and all that. And that's when you had, it was that and the internet, of course. But AT&T breakup was the best thing that happened, and it was, and so you can get that with the banks too. If you break up all these big banks, turn them into little banks, and you allow the commercial banking sector to start competing again, both because the big banks are smaller and therefore have less control, and you equalize the SEC with the commercial bank regulations, that's when you can really start getting things done. Let me make sure this is working. Okay, we're good. Alright. Make sure we're still on, and we are. So, okay. You know, break them up, and here's another extreme position. This is probably my biggest extreme position right here. Remove the stock markets entirely. And here's why. If you look at every speculation crash that we have had in ever since frickin' the 19 teens, the 1913, you look at it, where has it come from? Nearly every speculation comes from the stock market. The stock market and your trading of shares, it does nothing for the country. I can argue with nearly about nearly every free market mechanism that we have. But the one thing that there isn't much of an argument for is the stock market. Because what is it? It's legalized gambling, is what it is. It's you have investors speculating on every little thing, every little move that a company makes, and they're throwing money at that company that they think is going to rise. And just the thought of it, just the thought of this company is going to do well in the next 10 years will cause that company to do well, not on the merits of their production, no, but by the amount of investors. And so what do you have? You have these companies, these big companies, all they're doing is trying to attract investors. They're not trying to make better products, they're not trying to improve the services, they're not trying to improve their efficiency in any area. It is, how can we get investors to come to us? And then when you get the investors, then all of a sudden you've sold your soul to the devil, because now you have to keep those investors. And to keep those investors, you have to keep doing their bidding and do the things that impress them. You can't, it isn't a system based on merit. And so here's the way I think you do it. You don't just ban stock trading, but what you do is you mandate that a company list no more than 50 owners. Those 50 owners can split the shares however they want, but you can't have more than 50. That's it. That's how you do it. And I don't know, you could do it through taxes, but you can't just go to a stock exchange one share of something with in a company with like 3 billion shares or whatever. No. It can't work that way. You know, we have to get back into merit-based, production-based economics and stop this. I like how John McCain refers to it as the casino of the stock market, because that's what it's just legalized gambling. It's not, you got trust funds going off of there, I know, but it's just not a good thing for this country to have something that is by definition run on speculation. And, well, I'm trying to keep this left wing as much as I can. It's not very left wing, I know, but these are my left wing positions, and that's probably my most extreme. And then here's one: make the Fed public. There's a lot of conservatives who probably agree with me on this too, but I do believe it's more of a left wing position, because it's turning a quote private end quote company, bank, to public. And here's why you make the Fed public: because once you make it public, they have to disclose everything. You don't have to audit the Fed every time you want to get some piece of information. It's just there. And when you make it public and you make it have to abide by government guidelines and properly report the numbers, who they're borrowing money from, how much, where, etc., that would make it so much more accountable. And it would just be that simple. Just say, we are nationalizing the Federal Reserve. And that would, like I said, it would jump over so many legislative hurdles, all these debates that have to be had just to audit the Fed, just to get some piece of information. And by the time it ends, nobody's really getting the information they want. Like, yeah, you can audit the Fed, but you're not really getting anything out of them once you negotiate it down to nothing. So make the Fed public. Okay, now, minimum wage increase, short-term solution. And so, for the minimum wage increase, just the minimum wage has to go up. There is not a place in this country where you can earn $7.25 an hour and have an acceptable standard, even if you're working 40 hours on that. You would have to pretty much be working along with a spouse, them working 40 hours too. And then you might be able to make it if you have kids and a vehicle, insurance, etc. you might be able to make it on two people's $40. Depending where you live, of course. Now, this may like in some places you may be able to live well on that, but I just in the short term it's got to be above 725. I would say 850 minimum, $10 absolute maximum, and I mean absolute maximum. It's just it's got to go up in the short term. But here's the thing, though: like in the long term, you have to switch it to a qualitative standard because like wages don't mean the same thing in all parts of the country. So what you got to do is not only do you got to like, and by the way, in the short term, I should just add the caveat that like if we're keeping up with the constant wage system, do keep it up with inflation. It has, because that would save so many debates. But anyhow, like I said, in the long term, you gotta switch the federal minimum from a wage to a quality standard, and then you hold the states to that standard. And you can do it through the IHF. You can do it through any number of things where you encourage states to abide by those rules. Or you just make it so that states can be sued. There's ways you can go about it. But bottom line, you hold it to a quality standard of living. Like, for example, you say a wage must be mandated that can pay the person's rent, pay for the person's food, plus one dependent, plus one vehicle. You just add little things on that, and then you define that as the bare bones minimum standard of living, and you say the person must be able to have this, plus have X amount for emergencies, savings, etc. And that's basically the way I feel about that, because keeping it to a wage it does a disservice to people in cities especially. And this is where I really wish it is really more of a left-wing position when you think about it. Because think about this: okay, you're raising the minimum wage. When you're talking about a standard wage, who does this negatively impact the most? Cities. Because rural areas can, they can survive on $7.25. It's not a good living, but they can survive on it. Barely if they got two people working. But someone in a city, you're earning $7.25 an hour. Like, you're going to be on the streets. I don't care how many people you have working. You can't live on that. You live in, especially, like, take it to the extreme. New York City, $7.25 an hour. Even working 40 hours, you're probably going to barely afford rent, much less anything else. You may be able to pay for a freaking shack with that or something, like just some little bitty studio apartment in a bad neighborhood. Maybe. I don't know. I don't know what the cost. I know rent's been getting insanely high, and I suspect it's the same for New York City. So it's the solid wage is a lot of the problem, because you put it on large cities to have to raise their own minimums, and so you get cities like, especially when the states try to shut down any increases, like what was it, like Austin or someplace in like San Antonio, I think it was. They raised their wage to like $10, and Texas wouldn't let them do it. And they're in court with Texas now, I guess, or something like that. But you get states that are going to contest it, and you muck it up, and then all of a sudden people have to live on this low wage, whatever it is in Texas. I don't know if it's above the federal minimum. But yeah, okay. And then here's the final thing I have listed: too many wars. Yeah, I'm sure this goes without saying, but we really have a problem with allocating resources in this country. Like, we're more Obama, for example, focused a lot more on the deserts of Syria than he did Kim Jong Un in his nuclear arsenal that he was slowly building, and that's a problem. Like, because we're getting involved in Libya and Syria and Pakistan and all these places, Iran, who really isn't that much of a threat, and Egypt, like, trying to keep the Muslim Brotherhood in power when they overthrew Morsi, and it's just, there's no reason for all this. We're wasting tons and tons of money. Like, the Iraq War, we had a halfway decent justification for it, even without WMDs, but staying there, and especially as long as we have in Afghanistan, there's just nothing to gain. I mean, what are we going to gain in Afghanistan? Okay, so if we eliminate the few hundred ISIS fighters that are in Afghanistan, like, what's the national gain for us? We're not gaining much of anything. Because we've destabilized Syria, we've created the conditions where ISIS can thrive. And we just can't keep doing it. There's just way too much war, and I think that we need to focus more on our actual national interests, which don't align with the Middle East anymore, because the petrodollar is becoming a little bit useless, because we're producing more and more of our own energy, and we're going to be a net exporter of energy probably within a decade or two, because we're producing more and more and more, and especially since we have Republican, there went my left wing, but the bottom line is we don't need to be in all these places. Saudi Arabia is an alliance we should not have at all. Saudi Arabia is not there to help us. Saudi Arabia is garbage. They have been there to undermine our economic interests for a long time. They have pretty much used oil as a weapon to continue our alliance, and therefore legitimize their government and legitimize their national interests, such as having power in the region, as they're trying to exercise in Yemen by getting involved in the civil war. It's just, we should not be allied with Saudi Arabia. Even if we should be involved in Yemen, I don't know. Like, you can go many different ways on that. But overall, we just have to get our priorities straight. Like, we need to focus on the things that are going to be a threat to this nation, and stop spending so many billions of dollars in featureless desert fighting a few hundred fighters that are pretty much, like, we're getting very little out of fighting them, because they're like weeds. They just keep popping up, and they don't care if you kill them, because that's their whole ideology. And here's another thing. I didn't write this one down, but this is an extremely important one to me too. And that is a couple ideas. And these are big things of the alt-right. And I can't support the alt-right, because if you listen to somebody like Stefan Molyneux, he'll tell you of the superior nature of Western civilization. Ann Coulter, same thing. Western civilization is superior to all other civilizations. Now, being a component of that, being a part of that, and my ancestry being part of that, yeah, I'm proud to be part of this civilization. But to say that we're the best, like we are objectively better than anybody else, that's where I draw the line. And no, there is not a single culture, single civilization in this world that is innately better or more moral than any other. You look at the things we've done to Asian nations, how we've destabilized the African continent, basically every country on it, how we have just fought the bloodiest of wars, and we have done a lot of evil in this world. And there is nothing that makes our culture better than any other culture. And now I say the same thing about any other culture that says they're better than us. That's not true either. Because you can point to the evils of any culture, any people from that culture, what that culture's values and ideology have led to. And you can, because ultimately we are all human, we're all fallible, we all make mistakes, and our mistakes, our ideologies are basically a compilation of many different mistakes added together, hoping to make fewer mistakes. And every culture thinks they're right, and it's just, I think Western civilization's right, but it's not an objective thing. And then this idea that multiculturalism does not positively affect the United States, that's the most ugly thing to me. And you can call me a social justice warrior or whatever. It's just, I can't. To me, all different cultures have their beautiful aspects. Even Islam. Every culture. Asian culture, African cultures, Australian, Japanese. It's like everybody has their little quirks, their music, their favorite things, and what they want to do and not do. And yes, there needs to be assimilation. There needs to be a lot of assimilation. When you go into somebody else's country, you need to be expected to conform to their societal standards. But to say that their cultural customs just aren't welcomed at all is no. I love European music. I love Western music. I love Mexican music. I love Mexican food. There's a lot of beautiful things about every culture, and it's just, I feel like this whole, like, we gotta be homogenous like Japan is, and I'd say the same thing about Japan. Like, there's nothing wrong with what they do either. They're a homogenous culture, and they're uncomfortable with people trying to come in and be different. And that's just who they are. And when you go to a place like Japan, I've heard of a lot of people who go there, and it's a very strange place, and you got to change your whole way of thinking. That's good too. But me personally, I love all the different cultures, and like, if you come here and you add something to this country, and you're willing to assimilate, assimilation meaning and including learning English, and that's one thing that needs to happen. And I don't care if it's a right-wing point, but I think that every immigrant that comes here needs to learn English, master it, and use it as a public language, just as a form of respect for this country. Like, you come here, you learn English. I don't think that's much to ask, because you go to any other country in this world, But otherwise, as long as you conform to our standards and follow our laws, and you add productivity to this country, and you aren't taking from other people, absolutely we can have immigrants. And I'd want as many as we can get, as long as they don't do those things. And yeah, they do compete with low-skilled workers, and we do need to be careful how many we accept. And we should not just accept immigrants just because they're immigrants, or just because, we owe them something. But it is a good thing if they can add something. I don't believe in this Ian culture ideology of like zero unemployment before we take immigrants. That's just wrong. And there's a lot of things I disagree with Ian culture on. And really even people like Stefan Molyneux, where like he believes a lot in like having like stateless libertarianism. And I've heard him argue this with people, and he'll argue like anarchy, like you just don't think anarchy works because of your lack of creativity. I watched the debate between him and Sam Cedar, and I think he did better than Sam Cedar, but this is a point he loses badly on, because this is where libertarians as extreme as him struggle, is on the stateless libertarian thing. Like, you have to have a country, because if you don't have a country, where there is a vacuum, other people are going to fill it. If you are not going to govern, then someone's going to step in and govern for you. You're not just going to have no government, because the world is not going to allow that. There's going to be somebody who lays claim to everything you have, and you're not going to be able to do anything about it because you don't have any kind of organization to deal with that. And of all the things governments are bad at, the one thing governments are good at is taking control of things and killing anybody who resists them. So you got to have a government. Limited or not, you have to have one. Anyhow, I think I've gone on long enough, but these are a lot of my left-wing points, and this is just the people, like I said, who think that I'm just a shill for the right wing. I'm not, and I'll go over some other positions too in another video where I think both parties are idiotic, and where we just need to start looking at things not on a spectrum, but we need to look outside of that spectrum, outside of the box, for creative solutions that take aspects of what everybody is saying, or come up with a system that nobody even thinks about, in order to allow for society, a modern society, to exist where everybody can benefit. Anyhow, thanks you guys for listening, and God bless.